that is an inherent problem with government. Because of its coercive nature at its core, it inevitably leads to people seeking that position to say, hey, if you don't do this, bad things are going to happen to you. In that kind of arrangement, inevitably, it is going to attract the kind of people who just want to order people around and don't even care if it works. They just want to have that power, and they want to use it to be able to, play out their petty tyrant desires, and also to enrich themselves and the cronies who put them in office.
Thank you to the founding sponsor of Undivided, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.
Introduce yourself to people who have no clue who you are.
I am Spike Cohen, and in 2020, I ran for vice president under the Libertarian Party.
What is a libertarian?
What is a libertarian? A libertarian is someone who believes that you can do better for yourself than someone who doesn't know you. Is the easiest, 5-second nutshell answer to that. Obviously, any libertarian can give you a much more long and convoluted version of it, but it pretty much boils down to that. We believe that you, for lack of a better word, own yourself. You have autonomy over yourself. And that any arrangement that tries to impose itself, or someone tries to impose themselves on you, not only is that inherently wrong, we shouldn't be hurting people, we shouldn't be taking their stuff, but it also doesn't work well. If I'm making you do something because you don't want to be punished for it, or you don't want me to take from you, then there's no feedback on if what my idea is a good idea or not. Whereas if the idea is voluntary and you can choose whether or not you want to be a part of it, there's much more potential for feedback on whether it's a good idea. So both from a utilitarian standpoint and from a moral standpoint, that's why I'm a libertarian. I believe that we should be able to make decisions for ourselves and work voluntarily with others.
I believe, and I'm sure you will agree with this, that this is a moment in America's history that is well suited for libertarianism to expand a little bit. The pandemic, all the mandates, we had a state with some of the strictest mandates in the country. During the pandemic, how did you go around messaging about how a libertarian leader would deal with the situation that was presented to us?
Well, the first thing that I did was talk about how we even got here. I think we often, and even some libertarians are guilty of this, but I think often when we get into a political crisis, we often start at the point of that crisis and what we need to do right now. And that's part of the problem, is that that's what people in government want us to do. It's why we always happen to be going from crisis to crisis, because if we never take a look behind and take a step back and look at how we got here, then we can't figure out that pattern of the crises that they are either creating, or in the case of COVID, making worse. So right off the bat, when COVID first came to our shores, there was an incredible campaign at the federal level to try to suppress the knowledge that it was already spreading here. In fact, it was, I forget her name, but she was a doctor and professor at the University of Washington in Seattle who was illegally testing people for COVID as part of a flu study because it's apparently easy to make COVID tests. And the long story short was, COVID testing was banned in the US up until about middle to end of February. Well, that's when it was wildly spreading out of control. Then we have this shift from, oh, well, we don't even know if COVID is here, to COVID's everywhere, and here are all the drastic measures we need to take to stop it, and don't you dare think twice about whether this is a good idea or not. And I would drive home the fact that Republicans and Democrats worked together to both suppress the fact that COVID was here and spreading wildly through their actions and regulations, many of which had existed for years, and then work together to ramp up this, what in retrospect was draconian and largely unhelpful actions like lockdowns and mandates to try to stop its spread. And starting from that message, we can then talk about what libertarians would have done in that situation, and then from there what we can do moving forward.
Before we get to that quickly, because you talk about, let's understand how we got to this place.
Yeah.
What do you think gave the governor and other politicians the belief that they could put such strict mandates down for so long and people would just adhere to them?
The short answer is hubris. You get people who are some combination of consultants and experts, but basically yes men, who tell you, here is this great idea we have for you, and you can totally do it. There's not going to be any real downside. So it was hubris, but the longer answer is that it was hubris that was empowered by something that happened in 2005. In 2005, some people died in Asia of the bird flu, the avian flu. And there was a concern in 2005 that the avian flu could potentially spread from human to human and end up being like COVID or the flu. But the difference is the avian flu's fatality rate is somewhere around 80 to 90%. Almost everyone who gets it dies. And so the Bush administration had Anthony Fauci and the National Institutes of Health craft a policy of how to handle if bird flu got to the United States and was able to spread from person to person. Basically COVID, but instead of a roughly 1 or maybe 1.5% fatality rate, an 80 or 90% fatality rate. It was that guideline for lockdowns and mandates that ended up being used for a virus with, I think at one point they thought the fatality rate might be as high as 2 or 3%. So they were using incredibly draconian measures for something that didn't require it and did far more damage as a result. But it was the hubris of a politician, Governor Inslee, Governor Cuomo, my governor, Governor McMaster, every governor. There was only one governor, Kristi Noem in South Dakota, who didn't do any lockdowns.
And we're going to get into sort of the arguments against how libertarians would have handled a pandemic.
Yep.
But you said that we got to this place, a little ego from politicians
Yes.
perhaps, but you also had millions and millions of people who abided by every mandate without question. And we had that in this state too. How did the citizenry get to that point?
Fear, right? So if you can sell someone on the idea that something is going to kill them or their closest loved ones, or has a very high likelihood of killing them or their closest loved ones, and you don't have time to think about it. It could happen right now, it could be happening right now, and there's nothing you can do about it. Hopefully we still have some time, and if we do have time, the only thing you can do are these things that we just so happen to know will definitely stop or slow the spread of this thing happening, right? We saw that after 9/11. We saw that after many major school shootings. Every time there's a crisis, large, small, or in between, they say, oh, a terrible thing is happening, it's spreading like wildfire, and you have to do these things, or else not only are you making it worse, not only could you be hurt, but you're also a bad person. So there's fear of the virus, and there's also fear of the social repercussions of not being seen as signaling to others that you're a part of this.
I have a friend, Dory Monson, I don't know if you know him, he's a radio host in Seattle, little libertarian tendencies, I don't think he's fully in yet, but one of his fears that he's talked about is after the pandemic and all the mandates we went through, us just becoming a more submissive society, that the next time around, you know, the mandates are going to be stricter, it's going to be easier to get people to comply, there's not going to be as much pushback. What do you see as some of the perhaps long-lasting impacts of that period of intense, what some would consider government overreach?
Right, so any time that this happens, there is a risk that the takeaway is that people become more meek and are more likely to comply with something, which incidentally, that's actually an argument against mandates as well, because if people are willing to comply with what you tell them to do, you could just make the suggestion and say this is what you should do. And if the vast majority of people follow it, then you probably will have the same level of compliance that you would have if you're threatening people with, you know, fines or jail time to do it. But there is always that risk. An interesting thing that has happened is I think the opposite has happened. And I actually was worried too that would happen, Brandi. I was worried that the general public, you know, coming out of the pandemic and out of the lockdowns would say, well, I guess that may have to happen every once in a while. And there are certainly some that are still doing that. But I think we saw with, I don't think lockdowns are coming back. And I don't think they're coming back.
Not even here in the fine state of Washington?
I think there may be some cities that implement it. I think Seattle might do it. I think New York City might do it. I personally don't think that they're coming back. And if they do come back, I think that they're going to see way more pushback than they saw, because the American people have been disabused by reality. This virus is not going anywhere. It is endemic. If it does slow or stop in spread, it will largely be because of herd immunity that comes from people getting it. It seems that each new iteration or each new variant of the virus is more transmissible but less deadly, which feeds into the idea that over time this is going to become yet another coronavirus that gets us a little sick, which is what a lot of cold viruses are, which are coronaviruses that just get us a little sick. And that therefore, why are we mandating what people do? How is this helping? How is, you know, playing red light, green light with everyone's lives, how is that going to fix anything when it didn't fix it the first, second, third, or fourth time?
In those early days, when we kind of all didn't really know what we were dealing with, and I'll admit, as there were days where I was scared too, like, oh gosh, I am going to lock myself down, got a bunch of groceries. In those early days, if we had a President Joe Jorgensen, Vice President Spike Cohen, what would you guys have done differently?
Well, again, first of all, as soon as we knew, which was likely back in November or December, that our government knew that there was something going on. It might have even been sooner, that our government knew that something was going on and that the Chinese government was trying to repress it. As soon as our government knew that, we would have been telling people about that, telling them about the potential concerns for that, and common sense measures that people can take to try to mitigate those things as best we know. We would also not have, again, going back to hubris, we would not say, if you do this thing, then everything will be fine, and if you don't do it, you're a bad person, which is what we kept hearing both subtly and sometimes explicitly. What instead we would say is, these are the things that we understand work best. If it turns out that it's not true, we will update you and let you know, but this is the best as we understand it. Eventually, if the virus still came here and everything happened and there was still a vaccine, when the vaccine came out, we would say, this appears to be safe and effective at stopping you from having serious illness. We don't know if it's going to stop it from spreading. As opposed to what we were told, which is this is going to end the pandemic, everyone needs to get it, and if you don't, you're a bad person.
You touched on something that I talked about a lot, which is I wish politicians had just come out from the very beginning, said, we don't really know what we're doing.
Yes.
We haven't been through this. We're going to try some things. They might not work. Bear with us.
Yes.
If they don't work, we're going to change course.
Yeah.
And I guess that goes back to hubris too, is not being willing to just admit that you don't have all the answers, but you're going to try your best.
And the reality is that's how government works.
Yeah.
This is part of the problem with government. When something is mandatory, I don't really have to explain to you why it's a good idea. If I can rob you or order you around whenever I see fit, what reason do I have to give you other than I'm going to make it really bad for you if you don't listen to me? That is an inherent problem with government. Because of its coercive nature at its core, it inevitably leads to people seeking that position to say, hey, if you don't do this, bad things are going to happen to you. Both social repercussions and actual criminal and civil repercussions, fines and jail time and things like that. In that kind of arrangement, inevitably, it is going to attract the kind of people who just want to order people around and don't even care if it works. They just want to have that power and they want to use it to be able to, play out their petty tyrant desires and also to enrich themselves and the cronies who put them in office.
But what about for people who, you said you'd come out and you'd give people the best suggestions of the moment that you had to keep themselves and other people safe? What would you have done if you had people who were actively maybe putting others in danger?
Well, I think if someone is actively and knowingly putting someone in danger, now that's a violation of what we call the non-aggression principle. So, for example, taking a bit of a step back, libertarianism is not about a world of no order or no
I think that's a
no
common
rules.
misperception that
It
you're
is
like
a very common
free for all.
misperception that we want this free for all.
Yeah.
It's actually the opposite. We want a much more ordered society, but one that's based on an actual consensus of what people want, as opposed to the diktat of our betters spewing down on us what they believe from a top-down position, what they believe we should do. So on something like that, if someone knowingly has a disease and is going around knowingly spreading it, well, that's completely different than people that are just doing their best to approximate how to deal with this, and it's still spreading. Again, in retrospect, we know that the virus spreads pretty darn easily, and with each new variant, it spreads even more easily. This last Omicron variant, after 2 years of me going around the country not getting COVID, I ended up getting COVID. And it was interesting with this last variant, this last wave, the shame that we've often associated with getting COVID kind of went away, because now it's like, yeah, if you go outside, you're getting COVID. Right. So I think in retrospect, a lot of the times that we were told, oh, well, it was because of these bad actions that this happened. Maybe it was just because COVID was going to spread and there was little to nothing we could do about it. But the short answer is, if someone is actually knowingly spreading something, then that's different. But if someone is just doing their best to approximate how best to try to handle something, there's a good chance that you can probably trust them better to make a good decision than the people in government.
How do libertarians take this wave of displeasure from Americans over how the last 2 years went? And how do you try to kind of bring them aboard onto your way of looking at things now that they've been through it for a couple years?
I think the best thing that we can do is, part of the problem is that most people agree with us on a lot of things, if not on COVID, maybe on criminal justice reform, or maybe on the Second Amendment, or maybe on healthcare, or maybe on economics, or on public safety. A lot of people agree with us on our foreign policy, our very explicitly anti-interventionist, anti-war foreign policy. But they may not agree with us on other things, or they may just think these people have no chance of winning. I mean, Joe and I got the second highest number of votes we've ever gotten. We still got the margin of error. The highest number of votes we've ever gotten with Gary Johnson and Bill Weld was still within the margin of error. So a lot of people are looking and going, okay, great, yeah, libertarians have some great ideas, but they don't have a shot of winning. And I think the problem has been is that we have focused too much on races that we already know we're not going to win. Yes, they're important. Yes, we need to get the message out. Yes, it helps bring people in. But at the end of the day, there are races right now that we can win right here in Washington and across the country. We've already been winning them without even putting a major focus on them. We already have hundreds of elected libertarians at the local and regional levels across the country. Hundreds of them. We just won over 300 races last year. We can do a lot more of that. And I think if we put our main focus, if someone comes to me and says, I like your ideas, but you can't win, and I say, actually, we do win, and you can win citywide, countywide, and these are the people running, I think that's a better focus of our energy and a better way to give people an earlier buy-in than, hey, you should vote for us for the White House, even though we've never won it.
One of my issues is, and I've said that I'm independent, moderate independent, and I was actually thinking about this today because there's a lot of things that libertarians believe in that I believe in as well. And, I convince myself, but there's too many things that they do that I just don't believe in. But the same is true for Democrats.
Yes.
And the same is true for Republicans.
Yes.
I say if I look at all three of them, I'm about 50-50 on each, right? So I can be convinced. And I think there's a lot of people like me who can be convinced. So let's do some convincing, shall we? Okay, I'll give you an opportunity to be able to do some convincing.
Yes.
One of the things that, for me at least, feels like a non-starter is at least and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I have misperceptions or conceptions about libertarian ideals, is the legalization of hard drugs. Pot, great, smoke all the pot you want. But when I look at the streets of downtown Seattle and I see people overdosing on heroin in plain sight, I told you about my father who is a drug addict, alcoholic. I don't understand the desire to decriminalize or even legalize hard drugs.
So when we look at the opioid epidemic that is happening, we are seeing the final logical conclusion of the war on drugs. And we actually didn't need this to happen to know that. During alcohol prohibition, and by the way, I would taking a step back, I have been sober for 16 years. I was a drug addict of many different drugs for the better part of 10 years. I'm not a fan of drugs. I don't even drink coffee. So I'm not pro-drug. The reason I want to end the war on drugs is because of the harm that it's doing, not because I think drugs are good. I think that government trying to create a prohibition of something is creating a black market. So, for example, with alcohol, what happened? Alcohol, we knew that people were dying of alcohol overdose. We knew that people who drank alcohol were more likely to be jobless or have job issues. They were more likely to be spousal abusers. They were more likely to be, to end up in jail for various other crimes. And so between that and the Christian morality that existed during that time, then, we kind of decided, okay, well, we're going to ban alcohol at the federal level. Immediately, what happened was everyone stopped drinking alcohol. No, the exact opposite happened.
Yes.
It all went underground. The demand didn't go away, but now the supply, by government fiat, the government mandated that the only way you could get the alcohol you wanted was from criminals who don't care about the quality of the product. They don't care about your well-being. They don't care about the community. They care about making as much money as possible with no concern, not just for the laws, but for anyone else. So suddenly we saw massive amounts of violence in the streets. We saw these people that were previously two-bit thugs that were making money from the protection racket. Now they were effectively billionaires. They were corrupting governments, paying off politicians, putting their preferred politicians and police officers in charge to look the other way, which led to corruption everywhere else. That corruption wasn't just limited to looking the other way there. It led to more corruption in government. It led to what we've seen, it continues to grow, this distrust between the public and the police who were supposed to serve them, that they didn't see police as protectors, but as someone that was giving them a hard time for something that they were doing that wasn't bothering anyone else. You saw this just general distrust of government that grew, and you saw more people dying of alcohol overdose and abuse because the product they were getting wasn't safe. It wasn't certified to be safe. You couldn't even tell other people, hey, I just had this batch and it wasn't good, because you could go to jail for saying that. You had people were binge drinking to try to make sure no one could catch them. You at one point had the government poisoning alcohol in order to try to dissuade people from drinking it. And when they ended that, when they ended alcohol prohibition, almost immediately we saw a reduction in violent crime. We saw a reduction in the overdose deaths. It didn't go away entirely, and it was never going to go away, because there are people that have vices. There are people that have mental health issues, chronic health issues, and everything else that leads them into being addicted, and all the things that come from that. That's never going to completely go away. But when we criminalize the act, the actual, what is often a medical, mental health or physical health problem that leads to that being done, and turn it into a criminal problem, we are criminalizing people who are not hurting others. We are empowering people who do hurt others, and we're corrupting government in the process and making people less trustworthy of government.
See, I disagree, though, that it doesn't hurt other people. You go to downtown Seattle, we have all these small businesses that cannot survive. They are being, shoplifted blind. Some of them can't afford to hire private security. Police are underfunded in Seattle. You might argue with underfunding. We'll get to that in a second. But so I guess I disagree with the notion that drug use doesn't harm other people.
Right. So if I get drunk, I'm more likely to do all of many different things, right? I'm more
and you
likely
can kill me in a car accident.
I'm getting more likely to kill you in a car accident, more likely to get into a fight with someone. One of the things with cannabis, you're more likely to just sit on the couch, right?
But get fat, those snacks.
But the thing is, when you are doing, when you're heroin, meth, these drugs, very often you end up losing everything else in your life. You're now trying to feed this habit. Often you've lost other things in your life, which has led to you becoming addicted. And so now you're just robbing people, or you're more likely to be violent, you're more likely to be homeless, and all the problems that are created from that. The drug itself wasn't the problem. It was all the ancillary things that come from that. But again, we have to look at the root cause of what caused that. I can't tell you how many people I met on the campaign trail. They had either a mental health crisis or a physical problem, like they got into an accident or something like that. They ended up on prescription opioids. The FDA set an arbitrary limit for the number of opioids they can have for the entire rest of their life. So now they've still got the pain problem. They've now got a opioid habit, but now they can't get them legally. So now they're moving towards black market pills, which now are becoming less and less safe, things like fentanyl and other things like that. Even if you are getting the correct pill dosage, and it's from an actual reputable person who made it, you're not under doctor supervision. And then one day you realize, you know what would be a lot cheaper than this? Black tar heroin. And if you've already lost everything else in your life, you don't even care anymore. Very few people say, hey man, heroin sounds great. I'm gonna go start smoking crack or smoking meth or doing heroin. It's things that led to that happen. Often another thing that leads to it is getting stuck with a criminal record for consuming that drug. And now it's that much harder for you to try to rebuild your life because you can't get a license, you can't work in many different fields, can't leave your state, you can't own a firearm, you can't vote. You're kind of stuck in that situation. So again, it's not saying that drugs are good, it's saying that the government action to prohibit drugs is the wrong action to take. If instead you try to put that into a legal market where we can now check quality of things, we can get people help who need it without them risking going to jail. We're not empowering cartels, we're not corrupting government, we're not creating and growing mistrust between the police and the public. We aren't creating this incentivization of police going after drug crimes, which make them a ton of money, as opposed to going after violent crimes, which doesn't make them much money. So we have safer streets because of a higher prioritization of police resources on actual crimes with actual victims, murder, rape, robbery, and so forth. Everything gets better. It doesn't make problems go away entirely. There is no utopia, but it solves a lot of the problems that are being made worse by prohibition.
But you'd have to have the government then be in charge of regulating these drug markets, and that seems contrary to a libertarian ideal.
I mean, that wouldn't be the ideal, but I would rather have like what we have with alcohol, where there's certain standards for alcohol production and distribution that happens, than to have what we have now.
But what is a meth standard? What is the standard for heroin or meth?
Well, we know that. So like amphetamines, we have standards for amphetamines. That's the thing. We have standards for, and again,
is there any safe standard though for meth?
Well, not poisoning it, right? Making sure that the product itself is pure. But again, more importantly, this isn't about saying we want to have this thriving cocaine or heroin market.
Yeah.
And I don't believe there would be. I don't think most people want to be addicts on these drugs. I think that many factors, including on the war on drugs, lead them to becoming addicts that makes it more likely for them to end up in that kind of situation. And I think that removing a lot of those things helps alleviate those concerns. And then once that happens, the same way we do with alcohol. When someone truly hits rock bottom with drugs, we can actually get them help, and then they don't have a criminal record afterwards. Which is why, in the meantime, while the war on drugs exists, I'm a big fan of some of these drug diversion programs. Okay, great, you're gonna arrest them, take away their drugs, fine, but at least don't criminalize them. Don't put them in jail. Don't traumatize them with being put in a rape dungeon with a bunch of murderers and rapists, and instead give them an opportunity to try to fix this. Help them to get help, treat it as a medical problem instead of as a criminal problem, because most of these people aren't criminals. They're in a bad situation.
And I like this conversation, and because I'm going back to, I can be convinced, and I think there's a lot of people who are watching this who can be convinced. They just, the headline of it sounds like a lot.
Yes.
And when you say,
decriminalize fentanyl.
Well, right. When you talk about, not putting these drug users in jail or, do all these things.
Yeah.
Seattle doesn't. And Seattle hasn't for some time. We had a city attorney who essentially legalized personal possession of any kind of narcotic.
Yes.
And so you do not have police making drug arrests. You do not have prosecutors prosecuting drug arrests unless it's a possession with intent to deliver. Mm-hmm. And Seattle is worse than it has ever been.
Right.
And there are people who blame the lax enforcement of drug laws.
Yeah.
So what is it, as a Seattleite, I'm thinking, I feel like I've seen drug decriminalization in action. And I don't like the result of it.
You've seen a local level drug decriminalization where the drug war still exists and creates all those things. The addicts are still becoming addicts because of the FDA not letting them work directly with a doctor to get the pain meds that they need. The people that are being criminalized because of the war on drugs, and not just the war on drugs, but other problems in criminal justice that leads to people becoming criminalized, which includes a tremendous number of veterans. 1 out of every 10 people that is in prison is a veteran. And it's an even higher number for those that are homeless. They are disproportionately, wildly overrepresented in those, and that's largely because of the wars overseas and then the poor way that they're treated through the Veterans Administration so-called healthcare.
We can agree on that.
Yeah.
We can agree on that.
How odd that the most government-managed form of healthcare in this country happens to also be the absolute worst form of healthcare in this country. And so there are many factors that lead to that. And yes, if all of these other things exist, and in the middle of it they go, well, yeah, I guess, yeah, it's okay if you do that, then that's going to lead a bunch of people to go there so that they can do those drugs. The answer is not simply just removing this thing or this thing. The answer is looking at this as the holistic problem that it is. We didn't get to an opioid epidemic because of 1 or 2 bad whatever you think about this, whether you think it's that we aren't being hard enough or that we're being too hard or whatever else, we didn't get here because of 1 or 2 bad policies or bad ways of implementing those policies. There's a whole series of problems that are being created. I do think that when you criminalize people for something that in and of itself, again, in and of itself is not, that act in and of itself doesn't create a victim, you are victimizing that person, giving them a criminal record or making the criminal record worse and making it that much harder for them to climb out of the hole that they're in. The other thing I will say to this is that, and I don't know if this is particular with Seattle, but I know in a lot of places when they do drug decriminalization, they'll often just do lax policing across the board.
Correct, that's what happened.
So without removing the things that lead people into poverty and lead people into a desperate situation, they just go, well, we're not going to do anything about it when they do something bad. At no point is the answer to let people shoplift. At no point is the answer to let people rob or steal cars. At no point is the solution to let people, assault someone as long as the assault doesn't rise past a certain level of seriousness or whatever. Now, there are times where the punishment for that crime can be something that is more restorative in nature if the person is amenable to it and is receptive to actually trying to get better, which isn't always the case. But if it is, that would be a better use of resources to not have someone else in this endless recidivism cycle. But you still have to punish them for that. Someone is being victimized. Going back to the non-aggression principle, if you hurt someone, if you take their stuff, if you violate their body, if you violate their life, you've done something wrong and need to be punished for it. Government, private actor, doesn't matter. You should be punished for that. 2 more issues I want you to try to convince me on, okay? Policing is a big one for me. We went through the defund the police movement in Seattle. They defunded a little. I don't think they got as far as they would have liked to. There was quite a public pushback over it. We have record high 911 response times, trouble keeping officers around. You've seen all the headlines. I've seen libertarians talk about police states. Yes.
I don't feel like Seattle's a police state. What is your view on policing and where it needs to go?
So I believe the reason I say that we live generally in a police state.
My dad used to say that all the time, by the way. I think you guys would have got along great.
Well, there you go. So the reason I say that we're in a police state, and I won't compare us to like living in communist Chinese or something like that, but the reason I say we're in a police state is because we have more rules and regulations than almost any other country on earth. Like on a daily basis, the way that you live your life is more governed than you may even realize, because we often convince ourselves that we're free. We're actually just really well domesticated at this point. But we have more regulations than almost anyone else on earth. We also have a higher prison population than any other country on earth, including communist China. We have more people in jail, many of them for crimes like drug possession, drug distribution, which usually means having it in more than one bag, and other what we consider victimless crimes, where in and of themselves no victim was created by that. And it hasn't made us any safer. We aren't safer as a result of it. And so I would say, and then another aspect of why I call us a police state is, unlike in a lot of other countries, there is very little accountability unless it rises to a certain point.
For police.
For police. So like a police officer murders someone, there's a increasingly higher likelihood that they'll be prosecuted for that. Although for a long time that wasn't the case, because we weren't all walking around with HD video cameras and it was, he said, she said, and if she's dead and he's not, then you see how that goes. But because of things like qualified immunity, because of things like police unions who just doggedly defend even the worst actors among them, which signals to the good actors in police departments that, hush up and don't say anything because we're going to defend the bad actors and punish you for saying anything about it. These things lead to police perceiving that they don't have to do anything to stay accountable, and the public perceiving that as well. So that is why I say that we're a police state. I don't believe in any society, even the libertarian utopian society, there's going to be a need for security. There are always going to be bad actors, but that security, whatever that looks like, needs to focus on protecting the lives, rights, and property of the people that they are serving. And when they do bad actions, when they violate lives and rights and property, they need to be held at least as accountable as the rest of us are, if not more so, because they have a special license to enforce these things that the rest of us don't necessarily have. And I think they should be held at least as accountable as they are, as we would be, and they often are not right now.
Well, and see, and I don't disagree with that. And I have been very pro-police. I think people would consider me pro-police. But it's always been pro-good police. And to me,
no one's pro-bad cop.
What I'm saying is, I think that I sometimes get lost in that libertarian, police state as almost a vilification of law enforcement where, I want, and I agree with you, that you gave that person has a badge and a gun, they can take someone's life. What a tremendous, profound power that is. But it doesn't come across to me as libertarians having respect and appreciation and empathy for the many, many good police officers who are doing really difficult jobs. Do you think it's a noble profession?
Do I think policing can be a noble profession.
Okay.
My concern is that right now, with the laws that we have in place, with the regulatory structure that we have in place, for many police officers, including many libertarian police officers that I speak with on a regular basis, so much of their job is a combination of enforcing victimless crime laws and raising revenue on motorists, that it is less and less of their job becomes defending lives, rights, and property, serving the public, what they signed up for. Very similar dynamic to people who sign up to protect the country and then find themselves on the other side of the planet wondering, what am I protecting here? Why am I here? Very similar dynamic with a lot of police officers. They signed up to protect the public. They signed up to protect and serve and to protect the people's lives and rights and property and find the bad guys and punish them. And they find themselves doing a lot of stuff that isn't that.
But they do a lot of, to me it seems inherently like a noble profession. I don't want to show up at a scene where someone's been shot.
Of course.
I don't want to go save someone, who's being raped or whatever.
Absolutely.
So to me, when I hear you pause about whether it's a noble profession, as someone who leans right, it's a turnoff.
Okay. So I will say this. I think that a lot of the people who do it go into it for the most noble of reasons.
Okay.
Yes, there are jerks who go into it so they can flex their muscles, but I think for the most part that the people that are going into it for the right reasons. Mm-hmm. Again, similar to people that are joining the military. They're going in for the right reasons. What do we hear? They want to protect the public. It's been something that has been in their family, long family. My dad was a cop, his dad was a cop, and so forth. Yeah. We hear a lot of, it's a solid and stable profession. It's something, job security and all of that. People go into it for good reasons. Why I pause is because if your job is also to enforce all these other laws, it's hard for me to unequivocally say this is a noble thing to do. I think that the things that we want them to do. So, for example, when I will talk about my criticisms of policing, and someone says they'll say, well, the next time you get robbed, I guess you should call a crackhead, right?
Yeah.
They never say the next time that you want to get pulled over and harassed because you didn't know your tail light was out and they hit you with a $200 fine, or the next time that your buddy is smoking a joint and they arrest them and put them in jail over the weekend and then, give them an $800 fine, call someone else. They always talk about the things we actually want police to do.
The worst case scenario.
Yeah,
I can understand that.
Not just worst case scenario, the things we actually want cops to do exclusively. We want them to protect ourselves, our lives, our rights, our property, those who are defenseless, those who need help. We want them to be there if someone is lost. We want them to do those things. And I think in the same way that, for example, You ask me, is firefighting or first response a noble profession? Unequivocally, without hesitation, I say yes, because they aren't also doing these other things that I don't believe that they should be doing. They're not patrolling around looking for someone who is smoking and then, hitting them with a pressure washer because they might be on fire. They're waiting for.
Oh, I see. You're talking about. Okay, go
Yes,
ahead. I can follow along there.
Yes, I know my metaphors get weird sometimes, but the point is that I want it to be the profession that we want them to do. I want to remove the things that make people dislike them. I want the bad actors to have accountability so that it's only good actors that are left. I want people to see police and think, oh, I feel safer that this officer is here, instead of wondering if there's one of the bazillion rules that are out there they might be potentially violating.
We're going to continue my conversation with notable libertarian Spike Cohen coming up in just a moment. He and I will talk about how the Libertarian Party would be dealing with the current war in Ukraine. But first, I want to take a minute to give a shout out to my founding sponsor, 1530 Mortgage. Not only do they do new home loans, but they also do refinancing. And right now, with the state of the economy, I'm talking, of course, about inflation, about gas prices. A lot of people, especially in Washington state, where home values have gone through the roof in recent years, they are contemplating taking out a refinancing on the value of their home so that they have money to pay down debt, money to deal with other expenses, maybe even money to remodel their existing home. 1530 Mortgage can help with that, and they'll give you great advice. Maybe a refinance just is not for you, and I trust them to tell you that if you shouldn't be doing a refinance on your home right now. So check them out, 1530mortgage.com, or call 206-207-7777.
If you were the vice president of the United States right now, what would be the U.S.'s involvement in the war in Ukraine?
So if I were vice president, obviously I'd be having to wait for the President Jorgensen to tell me what to do. But if she tapped me to be the one that would be,
I imagine you'd be in line with what you'd like to do.
Oh yeah, it would be in line. It would just be a matter of if I was the one she wanted to do it. But if I were in charge right now, what I would be doing is the first person I would be speaking with is Vladimir Putin, and I would be calling him and saying, listen, we both know how we got here. This has been a pissing contest that has been going on for decades. At this point, your economy is falling apart. You are in the slog that we were in Iraq. You now have to decide whether you want to stay in this slog or escalate it and create a bunch of civilian casualties, or leave with your tail between your legs. You want to win. You want to be able to walk away and say, look at these concessions I got. We want to be able to de-escalate the last several decades of counter-escalations that have happened between Russia and their allies and the US and Nato and their allies. We want to take a step back and do a modern-day detente. It starts with you leaving Ukraine, and it starts with that, continues on with the ending of the sanctions, and then continues with us sitting down and coming up with series of step-by-step, verifiable steps that can be taken by all different actors to begin a level of de-escalation that gets us from where we are right now to what we eventually want, which is a total normalization of relations, full, free, open trade, great relations between our countries, and to whatever extent, even if we can never get there, get somewhere between where we are now and there to whatever we can reach, and get out of this cycle right now. That's what I would be doing right now. What I would not be doing is any of the things that are being suggested by a lot of Republicans and Democrats, which inevitably are going to lead to a hot war with a nuclear power that right now feels like their back is against the wall.
First, if you told President Putin all of that and he said, kick rocks, is there a plan B?
Oh, plan B is this thing's already falling apart, right? I actually got a lot of flack because I said that I didn't think Russia was going to invade. And there were two reasons that I didn't think they were going to invade. Number one, because the U.S. government was saying that they were going to invade, and it turns out...
And you didn't believe them, okay.
Well, so, a broken clock is right twice a day. It turns out a lying clock is right about 40 times, once every 40 years. So, but the other reason was because I saw that it was going to play out the way it's playing out. They weren't going to just, swoop into this very proud nationalistic, national pride country and just, take them over. It was going to be a long, terrible slog. They were going to start handing out machine guns to people, and they were going to be firing back. And then when the Russians would shoot back, they'd be killing civilians, even though ultimately it was, at that point, warfare between two people that are shooting at each other. That they would get international condemnation from all but a handful of countries. That there would be crushing sanctions that would destroy the middle class that they've been spending the last 2 generations building up. All the both inside the country and outside the country, Vladimir Putin would get less and less popular. Silly me, I overestimated a government. But that's what's happening. So if they want to continue this, then it's going to continue, and it's not working out in their favor. I don't think that the threat of escalation that a lot of people are thinking would somehow back this person up who does nothing but flex all day long how strong and powerful he is, who reflexively would have to fight back, okay? What that does not help the people of Ukraine. It puts them in the middle of what potentially could turn into a nuclear war, or at least a much hotter conventional war. That certainly doesn't help them. It doesn't help anyone in the surrounding countries. It doesn't help any of the innocent people around the world, including in Russia, who are against this war. It doesn't help anything. What it does is it makes a tremendous amount of money for the Russian military-industrial complex and the American military-industrial complex, but it doesn't help anything.
Quickly, would we be in NATO if you and Joe were in office?
Well, I don't know that the president can unilaterally get out of NATO, but the libertarian position is that we should not be getting into entangling alliances, which initially that was what the founders said. It was George Washington who warned of, I believe it was Washington, it was one of the founders that warned about entangling alliances. Entangling alliances lead to things like World War I, where one person getting killed leads to this giant war, and frankly, World War II was just an extension of World War I. Entangling alliances lead to a multi-decade long pissing match that ends with has moved on into an invasion of a country. I don't think it's helpful.
But if you take a strict non-interventionist stance, and that's what you have, right? And Putin knows that. I mean, the United States being willing to intervene on behalf of NATO allies is considered a deterrent. So if you have a president and a vice president who are in office with a strict non-interventionist strategy, wouldn't that just give Putin the green light to start a nuclear war anyway? Because you have already said the United States is not going to intervene if Putin bombs a NATO ally.
Well, the problem with NATO is that it has enabled a bunch of incredibly wealthy countries to not have to defend themselves. We heard Trump complain about this. We've heard even Obama complain about this, that we have this situation where the U.S. government is acting as the police for most of the developed world at this point. We're in Japan, we're in South Korea, we're in all throughout Europe, we're in Latin America, we're in parts of many countries in Africa. We are basically taken over the Middle East. And that hasn't made us or anyone else more secure as a result of that. So what I would argue is that if we started signaling, hey, this is going to end, like this is, we can't end it this very moment because we don't have unilateral power to do so, but this arrangement is not helping anything, then what that does is it forces those countries to start prioritizing and realizing we need to be able to defend ourselves. We need not rely on a country on the other side of the planet. And frankly, they need to already be recognizing that. How many times has the US government over the past few years drawn a line in the sand with China or Russia? They immediately cross that line and we go, well, you better not cross this one.
We're wrong, yeah.
If I were in charge of these other countries, I would already be looking at that. And I would certainly be looking at the obviously failed idea that both the US and Russia have been pushing, which is the so-called nuclear non-proliferation. If Ukraine still had their nukes that they gave up in 1994,
under the promise that they would have protection.
Under security assurances from the country that invaded them and the country that's sitting there letting it happen, then this invasion would not be happening. At one point, Ukraine had well over 1,000 nukes, several hundred nukes. And I think that a lot of countries are looking at this right now and thinking, oh, nuclear non-proliferation just means that the bigger countries can do whatever they want to us and we can't fight back effectively in any real way. And I think a lot of people are going to rethink their stance on that. And frankly, I think for the longer goal of world peace, more countries having at least enough nukes to keep the bigger countries at bay means fewer wars and fewer invasions. Russia wouldn't be invading anyone if their neighbors had nukes.
Well, and I think that's an important conversation, is how do we prevent this type of aggression in the first place? And if you had more countries in Europe that didn't have to rely on the United States to sort of be their big tough friend behind that,
yes,
that you might be able to deter some of that. But so you would, in the only circumstance the United States would get involved in a conflict under a libertarian administration is if that conflict directly came to the United States or was against the United States.
An attack on the U.S. or a clear and present plan to attack the U.S. And that's where it gets murky, because how many times have we been told they're about to attack us, they're coming right at us. But the thing is, we needed to have taken a step back and looked at that. Did we really think that Saddam Hussein was trying to take down the entire United States with his nuclear program that we had no proof of? In retrospect, no, that was silly and foolish for us to think that. But if there is a reason to think that there is an active move by state actors or non-state actors, like a terrorist group, that they're coming after us and that they're going to do something. We don't need to just sit there and go, oh, okay, the bomb's been dropped, now we can do something. But as soon as there's an obvious move towards us, that's when we can make a move. But prior to that, no. And frankly, I mean, if we know that a terrorist group is about to attack us, the first step I would take is to tell the CIA to stop funding them.
I saw what you did there at the end. I guess I'm curious though, because for me, and maybe I misunderstand, I guess, libertarians to a certain extent,
Sure.
that, you know, you don't like war, as a nutshell, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't like war, yet, you know, we would obviously be quick to engage in a war and enter a war if you had Russia attack the United States,
Oh yeah,
for
anything
instance.
like that, yeah.
But you have this, I guess, you know, just land border where it's like, we'll protect these human beings, but we're not going to stand up to protect those human beings because they're across an ocean. So like we're not going to engage in a war. We don't like war unless it's with these human beings and not those human beings.
Right.
So I guess there's sort of this interesting thing that, you know, what makes protecting Americans better or more just than protecting Ukrainians?
Yeah. So that, and I'm glad you asked that, because even within the libertarian movement, there are some who are like, well, we don't even really care that much about borders, and we're not about national
That's what's
identities.
confusing me.
So why would? So that's an excellent question. It's not that we think protecting an American life is more just. It's that we think that empowering the American government to do anything more than what is within its immediate jurisdiction only empowers it to create this arrangement that does nothing but enrich and empower a bunch of the bad actors, right? So instead of, if I thought that there was this way that we could have this noble goal of protecting everyone, I'd probably be a lot more agreeable to hearing about it. But we've seen what that looks like. The closest approximation to that has been the military-industrial complex. And it certainly hasn't done that. It hasn't protected people. It hasn't saved anyone. It hasn't made us less safe or made us more safe. And what it's also done, not only has it had entire generations of our best and brightest sign up to protect and defend the Constitution and the American people, and then get sent overseas to fight in a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with us, and then come home with all sorts of problems if they were fortunate enough to come home alive at all, and be subjected to a terrible system that leaves them in a bad place. But it also has given domestically our government an excuse to spy on us, to violate our civil liberties, to violate our right to, against reasonable search and seizure, right to a trial. There have been American citizens who have been assassinated overseas by drones. Like, this is what happens when you tell a government, your job is to protect everyone. That's not what happens. Again, libertarians want all of the same things that are in a civil society that everyone else wants. We just think government's a bad way of doing it. And the bigger of a role you give government, the worse they're going to muck it up, and the more they're going to use it to pad their pockets.
I actually think that Democrats and Republicans agree that government doesn't function great.
Yes,
a little
but
bit
it's
messy.
the other guy's fault. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
but it's their other
they
fault,
agree.
and they don't function
great.
great.
It's the reason why
Yeah.
that's the big sticking point, yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up, I listened to your speech in there, and there's some interesting points. I noticed that you focused a lot on telling your fellow libertarians about their messaging.
Yes.
Their messaging issues. And you used the word normies. You're talking to them about how they need to spread the libertarian
Yes.
movement
Yes.
to normies.
To normies.
Am I a normie? Would I be a normie?
My favorite part of this is that A, you're calling me out, and B, this is the question that I least want to answer. No, so here, which is why I'm glad you brought it up.
Okay.
So when I say normie, what I'm referring to is libertarians often, I'm generally speaking, there are certain individuals that are, I would consider, much more normally wired. Libertarians generally are not very normally wired. We actually talked about this.
You were like linking them to autism. Is that a thing?
Oh, there's there's all sorts of jokes within the liberty movement about how we're basically a bunch of weaponized autistic people. And
is there any truth to that? Is there an abnormal amount of autistic people who are libertarians?
I don't think that, no study has been done on that, but I do think, think about it. Let's take a step back on what we're talking about here. We are a party of people who seek to completely restructure the way that our society is functioning, at least from the government level. Mm-hmm. And we are doing so within this very small, it's the third largest political party, in the same way that if you had a SUV and a sedan and a Matchbox car, that Matchbox car would be the third largest vehicle. So we've taken this vehicle and we're going to set the world free. And we have these ideas that are based on a very rigid set of first principle philosophies. You were actually asked about that during your interview. How much of your beliefs are based on a philosophical foundation? We're wired differently. And there's nothing bad about that, right? Like, it's not a bad thing that we're wired differently. But the problem is every person processes things with a combination of intellect, emotion, and intuition. And it's different from person to person, but there's kind of a general range that most people have. I would say that the average libertarian approaches information and subjects and crisis and everything else with a little bit more intellect than most people. We're kind of more cerebral than most people, a little bit less emotion than most people, but honestly, I think some of us are even more emotional, but almost no intuition. We aren't picking up social cues. We aren't figuring out the feedback on what we're saying. Sometimes we revel in people thinking that we're extremists or that we're fringe or something like that. Some of us are attracted to that, and as a result, it's just like the worst messaging possible. We have what I believe is the most connecting and empathetic message ever. You own yourself. You have autonomy over yourself. No one knows better than you what you should have. You should be able to be empowered to work with people voluntarily to come up with far better solutions than these pandering, craven politicians who want nothing more than to rob you blind and to enrich themselves and the people who put them in office. But we present it in like the absolute shittiest way possible.
Like, agree with us or you're an idiot.
Well, the reason that you're an idiot is because you don't understand negative rights instead of positive rights,
right.
You normie. And so that happens a lot. And so what my speech was that you're alluding to, it was very specifically for libertarians that, hey, here's how we should be talking instead, because a lot of us naturally want to do this. And this makes us feel good when we browbeat someone into blocking us on Facebook, but that isn't actually winning people over to what I believe is the best, most perfect message possible. We're just bad at presenting it. And I say we generally. There are some of us that are really, really good at it, but a lot of us aren't. And I do think it's because we're just wired to process things in a much more almost... what's the word I'm looking for? In a much more cerebral way. We have a lot. I know one way that we're overrepresented. We have a ton of engineers. We have a ton of business owners. We have a ton of people who tend to look at things as solutions or things in need of a solution as opposed to having any kind of emotional reaction to it. The emotional reaction happens afterwards. But we're looking and we're going, what has caused that to happen? How can we fix it? And if someone else comes over and goes, oh, that's terrible. I can't believe that happened. We're like, yeah. And we're just trying to fix it. We have to be able to turn to that person and say, this is terrible. What a terrible thing that's happening. We're trying to figure out how to fix this. My belief is that this is what's going on. But we have to show that person we care about the thing first. Because if we just go, you're an idiot for even caring about this. But frankly, here's what the problem is. They don't care what our solution is. We haven't demonstrated that we even care about them. Why would they care about what we think?
I appreciate the self-awareness that you operate with, because I sit across from a lot of politicians, and self-awareness is something that they lack when they're talking about it. So a normie isn't an insult to me, it's an insult to you.
Basically, yeah. No, it's an inside joke within libertarianism.
Right. Okay.
And I honestly don't know if you're a normie or not. You already said you're libertarian adjacent. You might not be normal.
I have libertarian tendencies.
You might not be normal.
I think there's a lot of people, though, who have libertarian tendencies. They like the idea. They're confused about it in practice.
Yes.
And I think that's why these conversations are good about,
Absolutely.
hey, here are reasons why I don't think I can go in all the way, to try to talk about them a little bit. Mm-hmm. Let's end with this.
Sure.
What would you say to people who are watching this, who might be interested? They might be like me. Mm-hmm. Like they're like, dip a toe into that. I don't know if I'm ready for the dive. What would you say to them?
I would say look at what you agree with us on first. Because even if you don't join the party, even if you don't vote Libertarian, I'd love for you to join the party and vote Libertarian, but I'd rather have an ally on whatever we can be allies on. So look at what you agree with us on, because we'd like to work with you on trying to accomplish those goals. And if you disagree with us on these other things, well, then we'll be fighting against each other on those things. But I'm happy to fight against you on something we disagree with, or just disagree with you on it, and fight with you, alongside you, on the things that we agree on. I think as a movement, we need to be building coalitions, and I hope that as many people as possible want to join coalitions with us so we can accomplish as many of our shared goals as possible. We'll figure out the rest from there.